Okay, everyone, good evening and welcome to Module 3 of our 2019 Rugby Canada Match Official PD webinar series. Tonight we will focus on positioning, and I've obtained a little bit of feedback so far on some of these webinars, which has been obviously very, very valuable. A couple of things around maybe trying to reduce the total number of words and slides and having a little bit more video, and also for me to slow down. Apparently I talk quite quickly, so we're gonna try and make those changes tonight, and we'll see how it goes. So we had more video clips than I can do in the handouts, excuse me, for as part of the system. So what we'll do is make sure that once this video of the entire webinar is posted online, that it will have the video available for those to see what we've gone through today if they need to go back and watch it again. So just another note on the video is that we do have, I think, a little bit, they're a little lengthier versions, so it should allow us to properly see what we're going to be taking a look at today. But obviously, as always, if anyone has any questions in the domain box or the control panel on your GoToWebinar, you should be able to type those in. So feel free to fire away, but let's get started. So today, what we're going to try and achieve by the end of this webinar will be to have you guys have an understanding of how this module fits in with our Rugby Canada referee profile, have an understanding of what our two main options for positioning in general play are, notably around the breakdown, and how they are tied to what teams are doing. So we'll take a look at a couple of different pieces there. We'll be provided with some video examples, obviously, of positioning in action at various phases. And we'll be reminded of the importance of player welfare and the resources available, just a piece that we need to continuously touch on. Great. So how our module today fits into our referee profile. There again is the image of the profile. Our focus tonight is on a process behind what our key factors are. So again, if we look at the image of the profile itself, we'll see that there's a few key factors under each of our three pillars: game management, technical, and tactical. So the key factors are basically the outcomes we want to try and achieve over the course of a game or a season, or from game to game. So in other words, we're looking at how do we set ourselves up for success. We discussed this a little bit in the previous webinars as well. So when we looked at our pre-game planning, we used it as an example of a process piece that allows us to find ways to discover how we can work on trying to achieve a couple of key factors a game. So this is another step in that process. Basically, what we look at is, and I put good positioning in quotations because the reality is there's no perfect position. There are general rules that can be applied that will hopefully help us put ourselves in those positions to see what's relevant. But basically, good positioning should put us in that better spot to see what is relevant, notably at the breakdown. And what we'll do is we'll take a look at, okay, well, you don't always have to be in the exact same spots all the time after the ball's been won. It's a matter of how does the game dictate where we need to go. So we'll take a look at trying to implement some of that philosophy around our positioning when we take a look at some examples. So in terms of specific key factors, we're not obviously looking at how positioning helps us make sure that we have good pictures of, let's say, technical areas. The point here is that if we are in a good position, those pictures will be far clearer, I think, is the point we're trying to make. So all of these key factors, especially those around technical areas of the game and tactical areas that have to do with being able to read the play, will be influenced by how good our positioning is. So in general play, there's a couple of general rules that can help us out here. The first is arriving to the breakdown at 45 degrees off the tackle on the attack side. Now, the arrival position is generally meant to be simply at the tackle and the ensuing contest that happens at the breakdown. So we'll take a look at what we mean by that in a moment, but it tends to be the best position to see critical actions of our tackler and tackle assists, as well as our arriving players. Knowing that the breakdown, tends to be won or lost in the first 1.5 to 2 seconds of that contest, means that there's a lot that happens very quickly and a lot we need to be able to either manage or adjudicate very quickly. So being in a good position to start with tends to help us achieve a good decision or a non-decision as it might need in that moment, depending on where we stand. So hopefully this 45 degrees is the ideal piece, and we'll take a look at why in a moment. Once the ball is won, identifying where the play is going next. So when we go through our checklist, most referees tend to work a breakdown scenario with checklists. So as we go through our checklists, once the ball's been won, for me, and I'll allude to this when we get later on into our CMO section, but for me, the next thing to do is to figure out where's the play going, because there's no sense in me managing the offside line consistently, let's say on the short side of the play, of the breakdown, when the ball will continuously almost always move, depending on the game, obviously, to the open side of the game. So it's a matter of making sure that we're adjudicating and managing the areas of the game that require management based on what should be happening next. So then obviously moving to where the game needs you to go accordingly. We don't really want to stay in that 45-degree spot after the ball's been won, because that tends to be a heavy area of traffic once players are moving into what should come next. And then once we do start moving, to start early and get ball in line as quick as we can. So these are the four kind of key pieces of or the general rules, I suppose, of how we set ourselves up to be successful from a positioning perspective. And we'll get into why some of this is important just now. So I want to, first of all, now that we're going to look at some video, also thank Advantage Refereeing and Richard Every down at USA Rugby and MLR. He's the referee manager also for Major League Rugby, who was kind enough to share this one particular video clip, which I've split into two. And then we'll look at Canadian context and what we see normally on a day-to-day or a Saturday-to-Saturday as how we'll go about positioning ourselves. So we'll run these two through, and then if anyone has any questions, feel free, and then we'll get into the rest of the webinar.
Angle for the Lions, quick ball. Julian Redding has taken over the scrum of duty. Jansen van Rensburg. Yep. Victoria for the Eagles. With the advantage, minus Bossel. Searching for a bit of width. Line him up for his first touch. Looks too straightened. Back into the trap and gets your blow. It's Marks.
Okay, so I'll play both of these clips, and then I'm going to play them again and just talk through a couple of points that we noticed throughout, even though there's obviously some text that helps us along here.
Slowed down by Yanis Kirsten. Borsel. It's Van Rensburg. Electrical at the moment by the Lions. Track down by Arno Boerten. Slow ball for the Lions. Fight the track. Lions is a fly off one now. Minus Borsel. Comes it up a few touch. On the counter, it's Cochran. Off the track. Minus Borsel. Kirsten next. Good tackle. Important one by Janus Kirsten. Whiteley. Short ball for Rowan Janssen van Rensburg. Powerful player. This is Janssen van Rensburg. Let's go, blue tackler!
Okay, so a couple of key things to take away from these as in terms of context. So we're watching Craig Joubert referee a Super Rugby game. Craig Joubert obviously just retired recently in the last couple of years from refereeing, but positionally was one of the standards of positioning when it came to where we'd like to see referees in quote unquote ideal situations move to. The second part to remember is this is an extremely quick and open style of play that we'll take a look at why that's both important and not necessarily what we would see. The good thing that this video offers is an example of consistency in the referee's movements. So we're going to watch it again, and I'm going to just talk through a couple of other key points outside of what's been noted in the videos. So just coming back to the first one, excuse me, we have the text obviously that indicates that we're trying as much as possible to start at that 45 degrees. And then we're arriving early, so this gives the referee a really good opportunity to adjudicate the breakdown quickly, as opposed to arriving late and making a secondary decision. The moving early part is critical when ball's off the ground in 3 seconds or less at multiple sets of breakdowns, only because otherwise we end up getting left behind. So it's also a really good indicator for coaches and match officials that the referee is actually in tune with what's happening. It gives us a visual indication that the referee is aware of what's happening on the field. So when the ball shuttles back to the left, we'll see, and some referees will do this, most won't, but we'll see Craig Joubert allow the ball to travel behind him and not follow the ball, but instead he will turn to his right in order to then referee that next phase of play. There's no necessarily right or wrong answer to this. However, it is more based on, well, where do you start and where do you need to end up? In a game where the ball moves this quickly and the play moves this quickly, we need to get to that next breakdown as quickly as possible. Is looping back to his left necessarily the best option for that? Or does he just stay and move to the right, anticipating what should be coming next? Now, knowing he also has AR help. He has assistant referees who can help him with a knock-on that might happen behind his back. So that's what worked for Craig Joubert in this instance. It's not necessarily what will work for all of us. So we'll look at a few different options afterwards. In the second video, what I really like is this piece around working hard to be ball in line. One of the triggers that I talked about with a few referees is fighting to find the ball. So having a mindset of fighting to get back mentally, ball in line, in order for us to then be able to adjudicate what happens next. And in some of the later video, we'll see why it's important to be ball in line whenever possible. But the work rate shown here by the referee to get in that position is very good. I struggle with the word perfect positioning at the next breakdown. It is very good positioning. I would say positioning is very much dependent on individuals and what the game requires of us. So, I mean, in this instance, it is what we're hoping to see, but it might not be what we need to see at all phases of the game. But there's just good consistency in the picture of referee movements. Again, He allows the ball to travel behind him. It's his choice there. Probably not what most of us will do, though. And I do like this line about close equals presence. So from time to time, I've talked to a few referees as well about refereeing through presence. So managing offside lines on the side of the ruck, for instance, that we anticipate the ball moving to, by moving into a position where players on that side can see us. Here, the point is made in reference to managing a tackle situation, which is fine. And then talks only when they know that the words will be effective for players to make some sort of action, whether it's to move away or to release the ball or whatever that might be. So not being that white noise. And I think this is a good example of a video where we've had some good consistency in that movement, as well as some key trigger points that can help us with identifying where it is we want to go at certain points. And then finally, sorry, I do want to go back to that. Finally, the kick and open play is one of those areas that when we read it is allowing ourselves to be open to the side of the field where the kick will happen, understanding that we need to keep an eye on our blind side or behind us as to who started in front of the kicker, which would be most of those involved in that last ruck, and making sure we manage them if we need. No need to here, but just a point to be aware of. And again, just a good picture of the 45 and then the movement before the ball, and then transitioning through that chariot position. And we'll take a look at those kind of two options for the referee to move to after the ball's been won. Okay. So once the ball's been won at the back of a tackle, and we can, we'll take a look at Canadian context video now, but we basically have two positions that we can consider. The first being the chariot. Some people call it the jockey. It's the position directly behind the 9, or in that kind of 4 o'clock to 6 o'clock area behind the 9, where we can transition through, notably when the ball goes flow side and we've ended up, or we've started at the tackle on the short side or blind side or non-flow side of the previous play. So if we're moving from left to right, and at one breakdown we end up on the left side of the tackle, but we're going right again, transitioning through that chariot will be what we want to take a look at. And then the second more popular option outside of the chariot is our flat attack, or when close to the defensive line. So this tends to be the position we take when we have a reverse in play. So we've gone from one side of the field to the other and we're coming back, or we might be in the middle of the field and we might be alternating. We might be turning back from where we came, and these are things we need to be aware of as we go through a game. So in the scenario where we are in flat attack, we typically want to be on the side of the ruck where we think, or where we anticipate the ball traveling, especially when we're in the middle of the field. It's a difficult position in the middle of the field to be in if we're constantly on the opposite side of where the ball is going to go. And we'll take a look at why that might be the case. And then obviously to move ball in line once we've moved out of that initial transition position of chariot or flat attack into following the ball. So we're just going to watch a couple of minutes here of a referee. This is at the Women's University Championships last year, and we'll take a look at his positioning.
So Acadia needs to do something here to get that ball back and take some of this ball away.
So we see the referee having identified a turnover, puts himself in a position to manage, moves into flat attack, and then comes back to the ball. And then we see here right away moving into that transitionary chariot position off that second breakdown. As the ball recycled back, we see he got into a flat attack, tough to see there, and then we transition again in the middle of the field to that chariot position. And he does an excellent job here of fighting to get ball in line. Then he comes back and makes a decision. So when we take a look at what we see from week to week, this tends to be very similar to what we find. Although he does have assistant referees, I don't think his positioning would change necessarily based on that. So we're going to watch it one more time, and we'll just walk through a couple of those key points once more. But we'll see after the counter ruck and the turnover here at the breakdown. The referee does a good job getting back on the attack side in that flat attack to manage here as the ball is recycled, and then transitions back onto the flow side of the ball through the chariot. And fighting to get back to the ball in line. Does a good job here of getting back into his 45. See his feet, steps into the flat attack, and then comes back to the ball. And we'll see here the referee in this case, instead of allowing the ball traveling behind him when he's in flat attack, will move with the ball. That's probably what we'll tend to see referees do more and more at our domestic levels of competition. And then he ends up in a great position to make a decision here where he needs to, I believe there's, probably no opportunity to manage what he needs to, or the ball simply needs to be made available quickly enough that he doesn't have time to say anything, and makes a decision. Enduring advantage works hard to make sure he's in a spot to be able to continue to manage the game in order to try and get to advantage over. So some very good refereeing here. Sorry. Now we'll take a look at an example of where we have some slightly different positioning, but nonetheless can be just as effective. So our referee here, same tournament, does a good job following the ball out of the scrum. And we just see those few steps just before the ball gets picked up. It's a good indication that the referee knows where we're going, what we're about to do here. Gets into a flat attack position, and we have quite a few phases, I believe, of pick and goes that are going to come, and we'll see how the flat attack can be quite effective. Ideally, in that previous ruck, we end up managing the offside line from the opposite side of the ruck, but we'll just take a look at some of the movements. Good flat attack movement, turning around, and then transitioning through chariot. So we're a little bit flatter, but we're still achieving the outcomes we want, especially when we get here onto this right side of the field. Actually, I believe it might be after the penalty here. So we have a turnover, quick tap, and another turnover. And then here, as we manage our pick and go scenarios, we're seeing some good flat attack positioning in order to manage the offside line. Knowing the phases of play that are upcoming. So we can play very tight, or we can referee very tight to the breakdown, knowing what to anticipate. Allows the ball to travel behind her. That situation works for her. It's fine. It's there to adjudicate her next breakdown and the turnover ball that happens. So an example of a game where we have a lot of one-off runners, individuals who need to make um, plays in tight, and referees who have to make decisions in tight and manage the game in tight requires a little bit different type of positioning here. So we see the referee in this instance very tight to the breakdown in a lot of instances, knowing that once the game opens up, she'll have a lot of work to do to get back to ball in line. But in the meantime, in order for her to make sure that players are playing within the space that they've earned, that we're able to manage that space accordingly, which was a big issue in this game, or a big factor in allowing the teams to be able to play to their strength. So we'll just watch it one more time and just take a look at in close quarters, where we have some slow play and some one-off runners, how our positioning can be a bit tighter and still be effective. Again, this one here is probably the one where we want to take a look at just moving into that chariot a half second earlier, as opposed to trying to manage an offside line from the wrong side of the ruck. So as opposed to pointing to an offside line that likely doesn't really see you, if we're able to transition into this position here behind the 9 and then ask players to move back, we probably have a little bit more success there. But outside of that, we see a good effort to ensure that we have the space required in close quarters for one-off runners to be able to do their work. And if that's how the game's going to be played and teams want to play, then great. Again, off the turnover, when we have our pick and go, just being able to adjudicate that space. So at the end of the day, this referee's performance and positioning came down to some preparation done prior to this game, knowing what teams were likely going to be trying to do, and making sure she put herself in a position to best be able to adjudicate what would be most relevant in these situations. Knowing that there would need to be contests for turnover off pick and goes or one-off runners, and needing to make sure that there was the space afforded players on attack, as well as an opportunity for those on defense. So this is kind of what I was alluding to at the very beginning, where we discussed looking at quote unquote good positioning. Although there are ideals, there's also variances that can help us achieve the same outcomes that we want to achieve. It very much depends on what does the game require of us at that moment. So we'll just have a real quick look at positioning at scrums and lineouts. So at scrum time, in most matches, we'll obviously want to start at the tunnel and ensure that we establish stability. And then, same principle, go where the game needs us to go. That can include both at setup and put in, as well as once the ball is out. So we'll take a look at a couple of examples. And then at line out time, again, in most matches, we're going to start from the front. We'll establish our gap and our setup, and then go where the game needs us to go. So same tournament, got a former national team player in Latoya Blackwood refereeing our scrum early in the game. This was actually, I believe, already the third scrum in the game. So what I like about what the referee does here, and we'll see this throughout, is she's identified where the weakness of the scrum is in terms of players' body positions. and making sure that she maintained her position at that side of the scrum for the next set of scrums. We'll just watch. So the point I wanted to establish there was Latoya making a decision that there was a significant enough issue with what she had seen off the first scrum to maintain her position on that side of the scrum for a few different scrums, one after the other, even though the put-in had altered. So we'll just take another quick look at what she was doing here. So first scrum, and she and I had a really good chat after this game, considering we were both there. She knew right away that the initial side she started on, so the UVic or the yellow tight head side, was pretty stable and would be for most of the game, having known the players, and that she would now have to come over to this UVic loose head side or the gold loose head side. So her work here in identifying what the needs of the game are was really well done. The scrums weren't perfect on the day. It was a tough day, mind you, with all the weather. But she does a good job of identifying the fact that she's going to be needed in a particular part of the field, especially when we get to this second set here. Although the put-in changes, and for those at a higher level of scrummaging, what we'll typically understand is that the team putting the ball in, their tight head will usually be the one player in the scrum who's most likely to be under pressure, depending on how scrums are going that day. And despite that, Latoya does a good job here of identifying, no, that side of our scrum should be all right. And so I need to be here. And I think it was really well done on her part. Where we identified some work-ons were just her quick feet. So once the ball gets won, although there's a bit of a shove by white, the ball's clearly going to be won here by gold. And the ideal, again, is to fight to get back into ball and line in this instance. So it was just a little bit of flat-footedness, and we'll see the referee here have to shuttle across over the top of the scrum as opposed to following the ball back underneath. So just an area to work on. Obviously, the pass was forward enough that anyone could see that, but at the same time, putting herself in a better position here would lend more credibility to that decision. Good work by the team of three, the referee and AR, to make sure that they offered the option as well in that instance. Sorry. Apologies. Sorry, it's just easier for me to let these videos run their course. But again, same side of the scrum, knowing there's a bit of inexperience on that side and working towards that. So line out time. We'll watch a couple sets of lineouts. First one of the second half here. Our referee reestablishes their gap. So we'll just watch a few phases here. We do end up with a second line out. See the referee transition here through Chariot, knowing this team in red likes to go left and right. Going and transitioning through that flat attack through the defensive line. And we'll see he doesn't get too deep in that defensive line either. To then come back onto the attack side of the ball. Okay, so second lineout coming up. So the first lineout, the other part to note was where on the field we were. So most lineouts that the put-in or the throw-in team is within typically their half at the very least. Will typically be some pretty quick exits off the line in order for us to be able to either move the ball or exit. Whereas at this lineup, we'll see the referee at the back, notably because we're expecting a maul setup, and it allows us to be in a position to adjudicate what comes next. Now, I picked this clip on purpose because our referee gets run into, which happens to the best of us. So we'll take a look at why. So let's take a look at a couple of other pieces around these lineouts and just our setup. So the referee does a good job reminding both players at the front here of where he would like them to be, and the expectations, just reinforcing those expectations of the gap at the lineout. Obviously, being at the front of the lineout gives you the whole perspective of the field, and then quick movement once that ball gets moved by the referee here. Get going again. So we'll fast forward up to that the situation here where we have the referee moving into that flat attack, and then just because of how tight the play is, stepping into the defensive line and then turning very quickly to make an adjustment. When we step into the defensive line, some of us might have a tendency to get very deep into that defensive line, usually because we expect or there is probably an A-channel ball that's going to happen here, in which case we probably should never have been there to start with. That's one of those scenarios where we want to either be further out wide in flat attack or in that transitionary position of the Chariot behind the 9. So we end up getting to our lineouts, and we start in a really good position here at the lineout, knowing what's going to happen next. So typically, notably in areas, but not necessarily so depending on a team's strength, but notably in areas close to the 5-meter line or close to the within the 22, where a team will likely set up a maul. Referees tend to want to set up at the outside, and the reason for this is the ball tends to expose itself on the left side of the maul, on the open side of the maul, depending on how the defense is structured. But typically that's where we would end up, and this gives the referee a really good position here to adjudicate the formation of that maul, even without ARs. So this would probably be where we'd want to start, even without ARs. Keep that in mind. Where the referee gets caught is the fact that the maul kind of collapses or disintegrates fairly quickly. And then he reverts back to the flat attack, which is fine in this instance, knowing that we're going to have a makeshift offside line we need to deal with. But his movement into the defensive line is a bit misguided simply because he didn't actually have the time to read the play. These things happen, but that's that 8-channel ball we talked about. And at this point, the referee's movements needed to be either out wider or, again, back underneath instead of the flat attack position. So we'll just come back to it. And this is why it's important for us to recognize, again, once we've had a tackle and a contest, and the contest is over, the next thing we need to do is identify what's next. And that's just where the referee failed to take a look at what was coming next and put himself in a position where he was in a bit of a bind. So I think we ended up with a scrum attacking team here just because there was a potential try scoring opportunity that we probably needed to make sure we provided the defense an actual opportunity here in that instance. Okay, our last little piece. So just to recap, when we discussed positioning in general play, we're looking at a couple general rules. Arriving at 45, once the ball is won, identifying where play is going, and then moving according to where the game needs and getting ball in line. And then using those two main positions of chariot or flat attack. And then at scrums and lineouts, we want to put ourselves in a position where we can start at the very outset to manage our expectations. At scrum time, ensuring we have stability before we move away. And at lineout time, ensuring we have a proper setup and gap at the lineout before we move away. Following that, it's like anything else in refereeing, and we'll definitely get into some of these more nuanced tactical decisions when we get into some of the more technical aspects of the game a little later in our further webinars. But everything that we want to consider has to do with, well, what does the game need? And that includes our positioning. So where we go after we've established our standards and where we want the game to be, we then need to figure out where does the game need us and adjust our positioning accordingly. So, excuse me, a couple notes for CMOs. So a few questions that you would want to ask yourself and ask the referee is, are they putting themselves in the best position to see what is relevant? So we talked about 45 being the optimal choice. In most cases, we saw that we can be a little bit flatter and still have success. We can be wider or tighter and still have success. So as long as the referee is putting themselves in a position to see what's relevant, I think we can work with that. So starting at 45, adjusting from there. The best indicator that the referee is reading the play is, are they leaving early as the ball moves off the ground? So as a coach of match official, when I watch other referees, the thing that I know that they do to tell me that they're clued in to how the game is going to function or where the ball is going to go is how soon they start moving. So keep that in mind as we go through watching referees, ensuring that their positioning, quote unquote, is accurate. It's more about, okay, well, are their movements related to what they see happening in the game? And then another piece that I think CMOs can really help referees with is cues to help referees visualize points of reference. Or I should have added this, and I've made a note to add it to the presentation, but mindsets as well. So using words like 45 is one thing, but how do we visualize it? So I like to look at it as the gate. There's the four corners of the gate. The two corners on the attack side, we want to offset ourselves off one of those two corners. Or I use a reference of, can we pick the nine's pocket as we transition through chariot? So not necessarily where we have to be, but tight enough that we're out of the way of players who might be wrapping around, knowing that we need to be aware of that. There was a time when everyone was wrapping. Not a lot of teams do it at the moment, but could always come back. What's new is old again. And then the mindset pieces, again, which I didn't add here at the moment, but we can discuss, is the first is being fighting for the ball. So fight to get the ball in line, just a mindset of the action required. And then I believe I mentioned one more. The what's next. So having in my checklist that idea of tackler, tackled player, arriving players, balls won, great. What's next? And that'll help me look at the play to try and discern where the play should be going from there. Okay, and then finally, as is always the case with these presentations, just a quick reminder of our player welfare position and our zero tolerance for foul play. Quick reminder of some of the resources that are available. Typically in previous webinars, I've gone at these links themselves. I won't do that today, but if anyone has any questions around some of these resources, please feel free to fire away. The other important part about our positioning when it comes to foul play is that ball in line angle really helping us actually be able to see the actions of tacklers. So in that, believe it was the third video we watched of Peter in that women's game, his tackle decision was actually a high tackle decision, and his ball in line running is really what helped ensure that he saw that. Okay, on to some questions. On the line of touch. David asks, on the line of touch or versus 2 meters by 2 meters to the throwing side. Yeah. That's probably in reference to when we're at the line out. Are we in a position where, I'm just going to dig back to it here. So at the line out, when we are on the touchline side of the line out, how far back do we want to be? So here we see the referee virtually on the line of touch, as opposed to maybe in the pocket here on the throwing team side, basically opposite where the hooker defender should be. Listen, at the end of the day, it comes back to what I just mentioned about where does the game need you to be, and are you putting yourself in a position to see what you need to see? If the referee feels as though they're in a position here to be able to properly adjudicate this line out, all for it, right? Well, I wouldn't get too much into the nuance of, do we want to be 2 meters by 2 meters in the pocket versus on the touch line. It goes the same for when we're at the back of the line out. Most referees at the very top level nowadays will actually be where Peter is here in the very middle of the tunnel. Whereas typically when we introduce line out positioning to referees, we look at positions on basically the two corners of the throwing team. So typically we'd be on the corner here or the corner here offset. So, but this is where the game has us refereeing now at the top level, is in the middle of the tunnel, and then allowing the play to move where it goes and following accordingly. So no right or wrong here. It really just depends on the referee's comfort in seeing what they feel is the most relevant in these instances. Here, getting set up for a maul, I think tight to the goal line, we can probably be a little bit deeper, knowing we're going to have to come in a little bit. But again, referee's discretion. So happy for it to be either way, David, if that answers your question. That's our first question. Only one so far. Give it a couple of minutes in case people are typing. I also want to say thank you to everyone who was able to attend tonight after having to move it from last week. As you can hear, I'm mostly on the mend and ready to go for tomorrow's French one as well. So doesn't look like there's any further questions. So I will, oh, got one. Yeah, really good point here from Karen, just looking to reiterate that refs should be looking or facing upfield so they can see defensive offside lines and not facing into rucks. So let's just take a quick look at an example of that. And I think actually our best example is probably our Craig Joubert positioning at breakdowns here, where we see him constantly looking to move his hips into that parallel position to the touchline and giving a scan once that ball's been won to the offside line. So we'll see here transition through Chariot, again facing straight up the field. And then once we get to the far side of the field here, we'll see he turns his body again, make sure he's scanning for that offside line, keeping an eye on that. So a really great point from Karen here about making sure that we're in, again, it's about putting yourselves in the best position to see what needs to be seen. Once that ball's been won, it's about making a decision, making sure that we manage the offside line where needed. Yeah, great point. No ARs, which is most of us in most games, making sure that we do have that quick scan. So a lot of referees get into the habit of doing what Craig Joubert just did, was that kind of point down at the offside line to make sure players move back. And if we don't move our head, do we really know if anyone did anything? Well, probably not. So getting into that habit of adding that post ball one checklist of, okay, what's next? Great. Now we take a look at that offside line and making sure we actually get that head scan in. Great question around when teams do not make the gain line, what's our best practice from Sandy? So Sandy, I think a good example would be to go back to Peter's match here, where we can take a look at after this decision to play advantage. I believe it's after the decision to play advantage. We end up going back. Oh, sorry, no, it's after the turnover. We end up going backwards and we're not quite making the gain line. So Sandy, here's my answer, is real quick scan of the head. It comes down to work rate at this time, right? So the referee here, as the ball goes back, needs to work hard to get back into that 45. At the end of the day, what we don't want to do is stop in a position where we can't actually see the breakdown as it happens in front of us. So we're just going to come back to this point here. The referee gets bailed out by the gain line being broken a little bit after we end up going backwards quite a bit of a ways, and he's able to move back into a good position. But we see that it all starts from his work rate. So if the tackle ends up happening here, what we don't want is for the referee to stop just on the defensive side of the ball here, waiting for the action to happen. The ideal is for them to continue to move onto that attack side of the ball. Listen, at the end of the day, situations will happen in a game where we'll put ourselves in a tough spot, and that's because the game happens fluidly and everything is very situational. So we don't always necessarily end up in the optimal position. The referee does a good job of also not necessarily going all the way to the tackle ruck situation here, but rather taking initially a straight line and then coming back around in order to then get in a better position as the tackle happens. So to answer your question, Sandy, it's about work rate and making sure that we put ourselves in a good position here to be able to make a strong decision at that next breakdown. Okay, and Karen, as a reminder for those of you who will be at York University prior to the Arrows games on April 14th and 18th, there will be some positioning drills taking place, which is great. It's good to know that we're being active out on the field. I got one last question. April 14th and 28th. Sorry, I got those wrong. I have one last question about how close or far away should we be on the side of the ruck after we have found the ball? Should we be at least 5 meters to see room for the pick and go and for defense to see when the ball goes out? So again, not necessarily a hard and fast rule on how close or how far. I think we've seen instances where when the game is fast, we can allow ourselves far more space and allow ourselves to be further away in order to make sure that we're managing the game while also putting ourselves in a position to get to that next breakdown, knowing that the game will be happening quickly. In games that are slower, where we have either pick and goes or a lot of first receivers going straight into contact, we can be a little bit tighter to manage that space and manage that offside line. So those are probably the two things I'd say. The faster the game, the wider and flatter we can tend to be, whereas the slower the game, the tighter we can tend to be. Certainly, whether we manage it from more of a chariot position versus a flat attack entirely depends on what our preferences as individuals are. Okay. Well, hopefully I did a little less text on screen time and a little more video time, but I'll continue to try and add more of that component to it and maybe even talk even less going into our next webinar. So just to, actually I probably should put this on the screen next time, but our next webinar will be tomorrow in French for positioning, and then our next English one will be on April 8th, and our next French one will be on April 9th after that. So with that, I wish you all a very pleasant evening. Thank you again for joining us, and we will send a note out once these presentations or webinars are available online for further viewing. Thanks again, folks, and we'll see you next time.